So I'm going to talk about trauma, obviously, and PTSD and that sort of thing. So what is trauma? Can you go to the next slide, please? Um, in medical terms, it's a physical injury, but I'm going to talk about the other definition, which is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So anything that causes some kind of mental or emotional pain and is quite drastic. So, for example, it could be something like a car crash, a death, or experiencing abuse. And it's obviously not limited to those things. Those are just a few examples, and it can be it can seem a lot less drastic to a person. So there's a lot of different things that it could be. And some people will have a trauma that might feel minor to them, and so they're nervous about talking about it, or they don't feel like it's traumatic enough. And if it causes an impact on you, then it's enough to seek help or learn how to deal with it. It doesn't have to be at a certain level or something completely dramatic for you to need to deal with it or call it trauma. So there are different types of disorders you can get from experiencing trauma. Sorry, this slide has a lot of writing on it, but I wanted to put some definitions. So there's post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's a disorder that's caused by a traumatic experience, and it's generally just a singular experience. And then complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is caused by a traumatic experience, and it's generally multiple experiences. So this is usually something like experiencing abuse, or it could be as in maybe you've had a car crash and a death. It could be just more than one traumatic event. They don't have to be linked. And complex post-traumatic stress disorder is treated differently than post-traumatic stress disorder in itself, because with PTSD you can treat it as in, because there's only one event, it's easier to find triggers and find the root of things. If it's CPTSD, it can be a lot harder to find what's triggering certain things and to deal with it, especially if it's caused by abuse, because it's so much more ingrained. And it can be so much harder to separate that from, the actual person's general thinking and split the trauma from the person's mind. But that's not to say it's in any way worse than PTSD. It tends to be seen as harder to treat, but PTSD you can suffer just as much as if you have the complex version. And so next one's ASD, and not autism, but acute stress disorder. And this is less heard about, but you get symptoms similar to PTSD, but it usually occurs within 1 month of the trauma, and it will only last from 3 days to 1 month. And I put only not to undermine it, because it's still a really, really hard thing to deal with. And within that time, somebody can still, completely have a crisis, and, it can end up really bad. It's just in comparison, the timeline is a lot shorter. Then we have dissociative identity disorder. So that is what a lot of people know as multiple personality disorder, because that's what it used to be called. So I won't talk too much about this because I don't know enough about it, and I don't want to take somebody else's place and talk too much about that. So I'm going to stick to PTSD and CPTSD. Can you go to the next slide, please? So things you might experience after trauma. There's a lot of things you could experience after trauma. So anxiety, panic, depression, suicidal or self-harming ideations, flashbacks, memory loss, dissociation, lack of concentration, restlessness, or hyperarousal. And now some of these are mental health problems. So like anxiety and depression can be entirely mental health problems of their own, but they can also be just symptoms of something like PTSD or CPTSD, which have mainly the same symptoms, both those disorders, and you'll get the same symptoms with acute stress disorder. So that you can experience these in all different ways, and obviously this is not like the complete list of things because it affects people in so many different ways. So people might become suicidal or self-harm after feeling depressed. A lot of them are linked and things like that. Then you'll have some people will have flashbacks, and flashbacks is a category really of its own. There's lots of different types of flashbacks. So you can have emotional flashbacks, which is they can be really hard to identify. You might feel the same sort of panic or the same sort of anger or anxiety or upset that you felt at the time of your trauma, and it can occur really suddenly in another situation. So it's not in here, it's in the kitchen. Sorry. So with an emotional flashback, yeah, it's just the feeling reoccurring, and so that can be really hard to deal with because it's hard to place. But with a visual flashback, you'll be seeing the pictures, like images in your head of what has happened to you. So you might get really stuck in not knowing where you are. You might also have auditory flashbacks where you can hear things from your trauma. So a lot of the time these come with abuse, but if you've had a crash or something like that, or an assault or an attack, you might hear certain things that are related to that, and those can be triggered, or sometimes they don't have a trigger, which can be really hard to deal with. So for memory loss, a lot of people have this. A lot of people don't realize that they have this and it's related to their trauma. So it might be general things that you're forgetting. It could be, you've just forgotten to do a task that you were set, and this can be hard to attribute to your trauma because you might not realize what's actually causing that. Or you can have memory loss as in you don't remember your actual trauma. And so this means a lot of people later in life suddenly remember what happened to them, and that can be quite hard to separate from false memories and such like. But this, like, between false memories and suddenly remembering an old memory, sometimes things like hypnotherapy and that sort of thing can help you figure out whether it's a real memory or not. And having a false memory doesn't mean you intentionally made it up. That is a terrible thing on its own. That can be really hard to deal with and really traumatic itself, because now you have these memories and you can't tell what's true or what's false. But a lot of people with trauma won't actually remember the trauma, and if you have that, that can also be quite hard, because if somebody asks about it, if you're supposed to be describing it, for example, you might be describing it to police or something, if you have to file a report, it can be really hard to explain what actually happened because you don't remember everything, and people might not remember at all. They might just have a complete gap in memory, or they might only remember some parts of certain things, and those things might be hard to describe. Like they might be certain feelings or certain smells or sensory stuff. So next one's dissociation, and a lot of the time that's associated with memory loss, where I think the best way to describe it, obviously I can't speak medically, but the best way to describe it for me is you just don't feel like in touch with reality. And so you might experience things like the memory loss, like not recognizing your own reflection, finding it really hard to stay in conversations and that sort of thing, and you don't feel like you're innocent. So you might feel very stuck in the past or thinking about the future. And traumatic thinking about the future is often thinking about what happens again, how to deal with it, that sort of thing. So yeah, the best way to describe dissociation would be to say when you can't feel like you're present and you're stuck outside of it. So the concentration I mentioned is also associated with dissociation, and that can be quite hard to deal with. So that can affect obviously school, work, just having normal conversations with people. When you're trying to think about what to say, I often lose my train of thought when I'm trying to think about what to say, which is, so I have the PowerPoint here. I also have my notes next to me that I'm reading at the same time, because otherwise I would not know what I was talking about, basically. The next one being restlessness. And often that's because with PTSD and CPTSD, your fight or flight reaction is constantly in action. It's almost constantly triggered, and so it can be really hard to sit still and to focus on one thing and to stay there when it doesn't feel important. For example, if you're at school and you're trying to focus on the class and the teacher, to your body, that doesn't feel like the most important thing you could be doing. The most important thing you could be doing is protecting yourself, and that's survival instincts, which are triggered by trauma. So that's where the restlessness can come from, and also the hyperarousal. And that's hyperarousal of the senses, which can be also very hard to deal with and is caused by the same thing. Your flight or fight reaction is, very much in action. It's right there, and it's causing your body to go into overdrive. Please may I go to the next slide. So mental trauma can mess with your physical health a lot, and sometimes it's more than people think. It's not only things like having anxiety and that sort of stuff. But if you have trauma, you're much more likely to be at risk of other health problems. And a lot of the time, this is associated with the fact that with trauma, you have a higher chance of relying on unhealthy coping mechanisms like drinking or smoking and things like that, that can lead to health problems such as heart failure or other heart problems, cardiovascular problems, I should say, neurological problems. Trauma can lead to organ failure, because because your body is under so much stress constantly. It really makes sense that it's going to be hard for your body to function. So it can also cause things like functional neurological disorder, which is a neurological disorder, obviously, and it causes a whole range of things, from paralysis to tremors to blindness or deafness and losing your senses. It's a lot that can cause seizures. Really, like a lot of neurological symptoms, like a wide range. And with functional neurological disorder, there's not actually a clear physical explanation for what happened. So often ask, have you experienced trauma? And it'll often be linked to that. So with neurological conditions and having different neurotypes, trauma can also interact with that. For example, if you're autistic, it can be really hard to tell the difference between what's caused by the trauma and what are autism traits. And similar to ADHD, especially with ADHD, actually, that can be misdiagnosed. You can be misdiagnosed for having ADHD when actually you have PTSD. And because some of the things I mentioned, like the lack of concentration, the restlessness, hyperarousal, memory loss, anxiety, and all of those are things that are also really common with ADHD. So it can be really hard to tell the difference and find the cause. Some of the times it's easier to tell if they have comorbids to ADHD, and you can consider it like that. But yeah, it can be really, really hard to think about that. And there are certain clinics, very, very rare. But for example, I watched a documentary about a clinic that they're set up in a place that is very much disadvantaged, a lot of poverty, generational trauma and such like. which is generational trauma, in case anybody is not sure, is where the trauma tends to be passed down from maybe grandparents to parents to children. This could be through behaviors or through having told about the trauma and effects being carried on down families. So children often get misdiagnosed with ADHD and having behavioral problems when actually they're suffering from symptoms of trauma. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I didn't want to put a list of things about healing on here because when they're put into a list, they can sound really cliche and cringy, basically. But I'd say one of the biggest things is acceptance. And a lot of the time, after having trauma, people can tell you you need to either accept what happened, or if you had an abuser, you need to forgive them. And that can be really, really hard to hear. Because if you were being abused, you don't owe them your forgiveness. And it can be really hard to even start to think about that, because it feels like you're letting them off the hook, like you're saying, you know what, like it's fine, you did that. And so I've been thinking about that recently, and I think, yeah, I'd rather say acceptance than forgiveness. And that means accepting what happened. And so this could go for abuse or any other trauma, accepting what happened and saying, well, how am I going to move on from here? Because that's already happened. And not only accepting the past, also accepting the present. So if you have a disorder like CPTSD or PTSD, it means accepting that you have symptoms such as flashbacks, or that you have symptoms such as anxiety. And once you accept them, you can deal with them. And if you haven't actually accepted that, then how can you deal with it if you don't even know what you're dealing with? If you can't accept what you're dealing with, it's really hard to move forward. Another way is self-love, which is also something that written down sounds, again, very cliche. You speak to, therapists and they tell you, run yourself a bubble bath or something like that. And a lot of the time you're thinking, well, that's not going to help, like the actual problem. But self-love, it stretches a lot further than that. And it's part of the acceptance. Self-love means accepting really every part of yourself. And this can be every characteristic, every personality trait, emotionally, mentally, and physically. And it can be, really hard when you have to think, what are my negative traits? What are my negative characteristics? And then you have to accept them. But everybody has, negative things that they do or behaviors that aren't perfect. And you have to accept that. And then because it's you also have to love that so that you can work on it. You have to love yourself to be able to keep moving forwards with it. Can you please go to the next slide? Thanks. So this is another slide with quite a lot of writing on it, but I put together some exercises and activities to try. And so the first one I put is drawing different emotions and personality traits as people or characters. I don't know if that's easy to understand. So I'm thinking, for example, the part of yourself that is love, that loves other people, that loves your friends, your family, you might draw that as a character or as a person. And then you might draw another part of yourself, anger or pain or something like that. And you draw that as another person or as another character. And basically splitting it up into people and characters can make it a lot easier to deal with. It can be really hard when it seems all like it's muddled into one thing and it's just you, and it feels like all the focus is on you. So splitting it up like that can make it a lot easier to deal with and to do what I was talking about before, which is accepting all those different parts of yourself so you can think about moving on. And that's linked with the next one, which is addressing negative or harmful traits in yourself. Because if you're going to think about all the different emotions and different personality traits, that means also the negative ones. And that's really important. Some spiritualities and religions include doing work such as this. I know in paganism, it's often called shadow work, where they'll think about, the hurtful parts of themselves or any toxic behaviors or negative traits, and they'll consider those. So with PTSD, it can often come with this need to compare traumas with other people, which can be really hard to talk about because you don't want to admit that you do that a lot of the time. And it can be, when somebody else is talking about it and you feel like you have to prove to yourself that your trauma is enough and that there's a reason why you're so upset about it. And you feel that because you haven't accepted that pain, you might feel the need to keep on explaining why you're in pain, which can lead to comparing it to other people to say, yeah, mine's bad, mine's really bad, and that's why I'm hurting like this. And so accepting those things within yourself is really another important thing. Another thing to try is writing down all your thoughts sometimes, and that's even if they wouldn't make sense to you later or if they wouldn't make sense to someone else, it can be really important. And sometimes it's not even coherent. It's not even proper language. Sometimes it's just you might put random words down, random words that you're thinking. You might do like, I don't know, random drawings or anything, but it makes it feel less like it's all just trapped inside. And so it's more outside of your head. Another one to try is writing down exactly what you were reliving during a flashback. And you can keep it hidden or you can rip it up and burn it. There's different things you can do. Sometimes it's better to get rid of it in case other people might come across it, and that can be really embarrassing or it's a really personal thing for somebody to come across. But if you can keep it hidden, that's great. And doing that again makes it feel like it's more not just trapped internally, and it also helps you like accept it more so that you can see exactly what you were living, so that you can remember it, help you identify triggers, that sort of thing. Next one being to paint a stone that you could use as a grounding tool for yourself. And I know a lot of us here have sensory issues anyways, or sensory processing disorder, things like that. And that can be really heightened with PTSD and with trauma. So using it as a grounding tool is a very sensory activity. And so you don't have to paint a stone either. You can just pick up any random object, to be honest. You can just find a random rock outside or something like that and use it to figure out your senses. So you might have heard from, therapists or anything like that, the grounding thing where you do the 5 senses and you go 5 things you see, maybe 4 things you feel, and it counts down with different senses. And this can be one of them, and it's because it's a constant thing. If you're carrying it all the time, it can be really helpful. And I put painting it because I think that can make it a bit more personal, but you don't have to. The next thing being body art, and this can help, say, if you're at home or anything like that. This especially is helpful for if you've had trauma that left a physical impact. And it can be quite a personal thing, doing body art, or it can be just something really beautiful, can make you feel really beautiful or really handsome, and trying all different things. It's can be very abstract, and it's just very distracting as well. And it's another sensory thing, so you can really feel that when you're doing that. And then, sorry, I got back to quiet. If you try sitting somewhere natural, this could be somewhere like just your garden, like a patch of grass or a puddle or something, in the fields, in the woods, anywhere like that is a really good place to clear thoughts. The next one is changing something about yourself, and it can be like your style or your fashion style. And possibly that might sound a bit of anyone to suggest, because a lot of the time you'd be like, no, you don't have to change anything of yourself because of anything that happened to you. But sometimes it's really a natural process to change, and doing that can help you realize that actually you're not stuck in the same place where when you experience your trauma, because you can like grow and you change, and things aren't going to be the same. And last one I put is writing a song or a poem about it, doing art, or writing a story about someone who went through something and got through it. And anything creative can be really helpful, just to let your mind go, and helps you get your thoughts out. And say writing a story about someone who was similar can inspire you, and that's quite special because it's you inspiring yourself because you learned that story, and it will help you think of ways to get through it yourself. Writing a song and a poem about it can help let out certain emotions and that sort of thing, and it's just quite a helpful way of dealing with it.